that when I wrote that book, Diplomatic Theory of International Relations, 2009, I was very struck by how everybody has something to tell the diplomats. But nobody is interested in what the diplomats have to tell us about international relations. The historical experience of diplomacy as a social practice has a great deal to tell us about human relations, and has a great deal to tell us about how relations between separate groups should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
A number of good friends, scholars, have suggested that my approach and the approach that people like Raymond Cohen and Jeff Berridge have taken to understanding diplomacy, they say we are diplomatic romanticists. We have a romantic view of diplomacy.
That's
Rebecca
great.
Adler, we need better diplomats, and we need them to have more influence in a time of great uncertainty of the sort that we're handling now. Diplomacy, foreign policy, we think of it as something to obtain concrete objectives, but we're also producing the identity of the state through our actions. How do these theorists talk about the state is performed, and diplomats are leading figures in the performance of a state. Diplomats were well aware of this performative notion of social identity long before sociologists were. It was integral to diplomatic practice that they saw themselves as really. I can think of diplomacy as a social practice in terms of advice to individuals, to students, to human beings about how to conduct their relations. What I very much doubt is whether they have what you and I would recognize, those international offices of the corporations have a diplomatic understanding of relations. Human beings are learning animals, but human beings are forgetting animals. But any definition of diplomacy, it has to have some notion that it's about human relations. It has to have some notion about who does it, who gets to undertake it. It has to have some notion of on behalf of whom they do it, representation. It has to have some notion of what it's about, what those relations are about. And finally, and I think I've gradually come to this, the most important one is the last one, which is, and how are they best undertaken if we are to achieve satisfactory outcomes? And I think that's the clincher, is being diplomatic.
Today I have a very, very special guest, a living classic in diplomatic studies, Dr. Paul Sharp. He is a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota in Duluth, and he is also an honorary editor of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy. It is a very, very big honor for me to see you here.
Very kind, Alisher, and of course it is an honor for me to be asked to participate in this very, very interesting exercise. You have some very distinguished colleagues that you've already recorded on here, and I'm very glad to be included in their company.
Thank you so much. It's a real big pleasure and honor for me. And again, you are the most prominent scholar in diplomatic studies in the United States. So it's something very special.
You must tell my boss that.
Anyway, let's start. Paul, you are very well known with your wonderful books and very powerful articles. And you spent many years in studying and thinking about diplomacy. I'd like to ask you, how's your attitude towards diplomacy changed, if changed?
I think my first thought there is that diplomacy never goes away. We will always see human relations, which we recognize as diplomacy, being conducted. The only question, or not the only question, but the most important question is how well they are conducted. And I think the quality of the conduct depends on people putting the stock of human experience that we've learned down the centuries to work in the conduct of diplomacy. And I still think that the modern diplomatic system, as it evolved in Europe and developed to a global system, still has a lot to tell us about how to conduct diplomacy effectively. So that's the good news. It's always there. I think that I would not be alone in suggesting that the sort of values and priorities that are necessary for good diplomacy are not very well respected in contemporary international relations, and not very well respected or valued or even known by the plethora of new actors who we regard as potentially being diplomatic actors in international relations. So the game is being played, but it is not being well played. How about that?
All right, but why? Why it is not so well recognized in the field of international relations
Okay.
and
I think
also in universities?
it's, well, interestingly, what we've seen is a huge expansion of academic interest in diplomacy, diplomatic
Right.
studies, as you style it, which is very, very gratifying because and not in some disciplines, history has always been interested in diplomacy, but the social sciences and particularly international relations didn't pay a great deal of attention to diplomacy.
But why?
Uh, well, the answer that people typically put forward here is that IR as a subject sees the world in structural terms, and that it is the structure, whether the distribution of power or the distribution of wealth, which profoundly shapes the options available to actors in the international system. The people who are more interested in agency and
Mm,
choice
mm,
have tended to gravitate towards foreign policy analysis
mm.
and have looked at the processes by which, largely domestic processes, by which policy choices are made. And the relational part, how states and others actually conduct their relations with each other, was neglected. And
Yeah.
that was the big push. And so, for example, at the ISA meeting in Chicago that we both attended, I think there were something like about 40 or 50 panels associated with diplomacy.
Right.
Uh, the people who identify as students of diplomacy now number in the hundreds. And in 1990, I think it was 1994 or 5, when we started out, we had 4 panels at the ISA and no section. So we see a growth in terms of the number of people who
Right.
are studying diplomacy. But as interest in the study of diplomacy has expanded, it's increasingly difficult to, for me at least, to understand. So, what are we talking about when we talk about diplomacy? Um, we have approaches that focus on micro sociologies,
Right.
how diplomats use their cell phones, how they use social media. And it seems to me that these are very interesting researchable questions, but they don't make the case which originally pushed for studying diplomacy, which is
Mm.
that diplomacy is important. We're not just interested in their working habits any more than we're interested in how you and I use social media or how we use our cell phones in international relations. The premise is that the way diplomacy is conducted has an impact, for good or ill, on the outcomes. And I'm
Mm.
not sure that our growth of interest in diplomacy is reflecting that original idea that diplomacy is important. And I do think there is a bit of a problem there. The question I always ask my younger colleagues is, what is the difference between diplomatic relations and international relations? Are all international relations diplomatic, or are only some of them diplomatic? In which case, how do we define that in terms of actors, in terms of issues, in terms of the way they are conducted, which is what I'm interested in. The other thing I think is that when I wrote that book, Diplomatic Theory of International Relations, 2009, I was very struck by how everybody has something to tell the diplomats. But nobody is interested in what the diplomats have to tell us about international relations. So we have economists, political scientists, we have sociologists, we have people from every walk of life, and our colleagues in diplomatic studies are constantly importing insights from other fields into the study of diplomacy. And I try to argue that actually the historical experience of diplomacy as a social practice has a great deal to tell us about human relations, and has a great deal to tell us about how relations between separate groups should be.
Yeah, absolutely. International Studies Association's diplomatic section, as we learned, now it has 499 members. And it is the fastest growing section in ISA, which is
very impressive.
Yeah, very impressive. And of course, we could speak about some very dynamic development of diplomatic studies. And of course, your input, your influence was huge in all this development. But let me ask you about how do you see the state of diplomatic studies now? We see that on the one hand, still not very many people understand or want to understand diplomacy. Still, it has not very, how to say, a good place in university setting. But nevertheless, we see very dynamic development of diplomatic studies and huge interest in being within diplomatic studies and somehow contributing to it. So how do you see the state of diplomatic studies now? What are the field's key strengths and weaknesses now?
I think, first of all, the material growth in numbers is terribly important. And I'm a great believer in more is better, generally speaking. And that is absolutely gratifying. As the person who presented the case for a diplomatic studies section to the ISA Governing Council, I was treated with skepticism about proposing this new section on the basis that they thought it might be looking backwards, be conservative, be not echoing the values of the institution. That was by no means everybody, but there were certain people who were very skeptical of what we were trying to do there. And I think we've got way past that now. That we're moving into a sort of mainstream. The challenge, I think, facing next generation, not us, mercifully, Alisher, we don't have to worry about this, but they do, is, as I suggested, us becoming less and less clear what we're talking about. And in some sense, diplomatic studies might be hurt by its own success, in that the water trickles out over the sand ever wider and becomes thinner and finally disappears back into international relations again. And there are some of our colleagues who say this is not a big problem, that diplomacy is whatever people want to identify as diplomacy. And as scholars of diplomacy, we simply study what people talk about when they talk about diplomacy. In that sense, you say it's not our problem to define diplomacy. It is our task to see how others use the term and why they use the term. I can see the value and the merits of that, but I also see the dangers of it. If you were to criticize my argument, a number of good friends, scholars, have suggested that my approach and the approach that people like Raymond Cohen and Jeff Berridge have taken to understanding diplomacy, they say we are diplomatic romanticists. We have a romantic view of diplomacy.
That's great. That's great.
Rebecca Adler-Nissen, whose work I greatly admire and is a great friend as a colleague, and she has had the advantage of actually working like you as a diplomat, and I as an academic. She says you have way too romantic a view of diplomats. The idea of diplomats as heroes who, through their skills, their subtlety, their ability to work with different personalities, can produce huge outcomes. And more like Eva Neumann, she says, no, they're just people with careers, worrying about their pensions, worrying about their postings. So there's that banal side of things. But I think that a time like the present, where we're getting, for example, we're hearing that story of how the central decision-making group in American foreign policy included a journalist in their deliberations about attacking the Houthis. I think we need better diplomats, and we need them to have more influence in a time of great uncertainty of the sort that we're handling now. And if the people in Saudi Arabia currently talking, excuse me, approach these issues with the same superficiality that we saw in those deliberations yesterday. Actually, I'm more interested in how they talked about the issue than the fact that it leaked. Then I think we have grounds to worry.
Well, that's great. That's wonderful to have such romantics in diplomatic studies. That's we need them, and we need these kinds of a human approach, social approach. But at the same time, as a former diplomat, I should notice that very few scholars pay attention to the routine side of diplomacy.
Very good.
There are a lot of course, very intriguing, very absolutely wonderful, exciting sides. You are making impact, you are negotiating some interesting stuff, etc., etc. But most part of diplomacy is a routine. So a lot of routine work. And
Yes.
I would be very much interested in reading some nice research about some boring routine side of diplomacy as well, because it is a big part of it. So you have to be right. Anyway, there are different sides. But I'd like to mention your latest book, which was, I believe, published a few years ago in 2019, Diplomacy in the 21st Century, a brief introduction. You said that you distinguish two types of diplomacy there. One is diplomacy of relations, and the other one is diplomacy of problem solving. So could you please explain what does it mean? What are some differences between these two types of diplomacies?
Yes. I think a simple way of thinking of the distinction is to conceive of diplomacy as a construction project, building international order, building international institutions, and increasingly these days trying to defend international institutions and have them retain their importance and relevance. I think, and this is a very old-fashioned view, I suppose, that we have simply overreached ourselves in terms of the construction projects. The political will, the shared identities are just not there that bear the weight. And if one loses, let's call it a hegemonic power capable of enforcing, rewarding good behavior, if we lose that, then this construction project is going to be in trouble. And I think that diplomats and those who study them have tended to focus on the institutional side and not on the human relations side, the sort of thing that Marcus Holmes is interested in, the psychology and the experimental side, what experimental psychology has to tell us about how human beings relate to each other. And so we've, if you like, this is very generalizing terms, but we have diplomats who instinctively see their task as extending and defending institutions. And the metaphors are those of construction and maintaining. But of course, diplomacy as a practice predates institutionalized forms of cooperation. And as you've correctly suggested, that's where the human element and the management of leaders. I think I don't have to make my case in a world with Xi, Putin, and Trump, that we are probably wiser to look on how should diplomats work with their bosses than how should they try and keep the IMF relevant or make sure that the European Union still continues to speak with one voice. I've always been a Eurosceptic in many ways, and I'm still struck by the way in which the European Union culture of diplomacy sees the construction of a joint statement as an achievement, as opposed to translating that into action. And I think the basis for effective action, let's stay with Europe for the moment, remains these nation states, sovereign states. If you want Germany, France, Great Britain to concentrate on the problems being created by Russia, stop trying to channel it through European Union structures and get them to sort out their own agendas for themselves first. But I think I'm getting perilously near talking about policy rather than diplomacy there. So I should stop on that theme at that point.
But you are constructivist, so they are also constructing some new reality, which is also a kind of constructivist approach.
That is a fair point. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So coming back to diplomacy of relations and diplomacy of problem solving.
Yes.
You one more time clearly define the differences. So can we understand this like sometimes diplomacy's task is just keeping and developing relationships. This is the main task and main activity. But sometimes it's not about relationship, but it is about just solving problem without much thinking about relationship. Is it a kind of approach or a little different?
Yes, well, I think there's an obvious weakness in my argument. If you take issues, for example, like climate change, that is a problem in need of a solution, and as the solution will have to come through institutionalized collaboration rather than in individual actors. But if we're constantly mistaking the ability to generate agreed positions for substantial change, that's where I think we're in difficulties. To use this is dangerous to do this, but to use a historical parallel, think of the attempts as the dictators rose in Europe in the 1930s, and the diplomatic emphasis was still for a long time on how do we make the League of Nations work better. And of course, as the realists tell us, the League of Nations have become irrelevant to the kind of challenges that were facing the international system at that time, more pressing and immediate problems. When I wrote that book, it was intended as an introductory textbook, and it was during the first Trump administration. So what people were paying a great deal of attention to was how what they used to call the grown-ups in his administration, the foreign policy, strategy, defense experts tried to manage him by ignoring him or circumventing him or waiting till he changed his mind again, and occasionally confronting him. So I was very interested at the time in how leaders can be managed by their diplomats. Now, the trouble is, of course, that the leader has to be open to being managed, has to acknowledge the expertise, and has to sympathize with the priorities, which he might not share, but recognize they're valuable in his senior advisors, his or hers. And that was my problem, that I was thinking about that. And that's why I was focusing on relations. How do you manage human relations of the other fellow's boss, but of your own boss too? So that was the narrowness there. Interestingly, I will say something nice about President Trump, who we tend to think of as the antithesis in terms of his priorities to what we value in diplomacy. But one of the striking things about him has been his determination to talk to anybody if he thinks it will produce results. Now, I don't know how well he does it, but to me, that is very much the starting point of diplomacy, and very much with the American tradition. And the American tradition is you make decisions about the moral worth of an actor, and can we talk to these people if they are so bad? And Trump's approach is let's talk to them and see what comes from it. And also we can talk to them and bomb them at the same time. But the important thing is to keep talking. And I think that, if you like, is the other side of my emphasis on the diplomacy of relations. It's when we do not like each other, do not trust each other, then it's now more than ever that we should be talking. And I see the restoration of a fuller contact between Moscow and Washington in those terms. And the restaffing of the embassies, I see not in so much in terms of the practical work, but of the signaling that they are back to talking with each other. Now, of course, there are many reasons for worrying about the outcomes of the talks at the present. But nevertheless, speaking narrowly in diplomatic terms, I think that's a value, and one that for I don't know whether it's his hubris, confidence, or humanity, but he'll talk to anybody. And I think that is a diplomatic orientation to international relations and human relations.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree with you. One of the mission of diplomacy is talking to the enemies or to those who are different from you. So if you are just talking to friends and nice people, there is a very little point for reason for diplomacy. So, and also
you must be well prepared for those conversations. And I'm not convinced that our president is.
Of course, it doesn't mean that you would agree with everything what other side is saying, but you have to maintain some sort of connection, talking, listening, understanding. That's the very essence of diplomacy. But as far as problem solving in relationship in diplomacy, I believe that in diplomacy it's very difficult to distinguish them. Of course, as a big picture, we could see these two things, but very often, in order to solve problem, you have to develop relationship. So solving relationship building could be big part of problem solving. And problem solving could be a big part of relationship building. They are very much interdependent very often.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And my argument at the time was that we were not paying enough attention to relationship building,
Right.
and paying a great deal of attention to an impetus towards institutions which developed after 1945. And perhaps that particular surge of institution building had peaked and was not the place to be emphasizing in our studies of diplomacy.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. It's not one or the other. It's just a question of how much attention you should be paying to each. Yes.
Of course. And in the same book we're referring to, you wrote that everyone gets to be a diplomat and do diplomacy some of the time. So it's quite a wider understanding of diplomacy, which I fully agree with. Would you please explain this?
The way I explain it to my students in class is I say there's a diplomatic component to many human relations. And I say, for example, when you come to class and say, Professor Sharp, I missed the last class. Did I miss anything important? Now there is a failing of diplomacy. And it is one that the students mostly understand. Understand, and that is the capacity to read the different levels of the interlocutor, the person you're talking to, and their concerns and their priorities. It is an innocent question. Did I miss anything important? But the implication, of course, is that last Wednesday we sat in the classroom doing nothing important. And it is that sensibility to other people and their priorities and their concerns, and not just in a civility sense, a humane sense of caring about other people, although I think that's the real driver, but also if you want to get what you want from somebody, you need to pay attention to those kinds of concerns. So there is and Hedley Bull talked about this. He said there's diplomacy in the institutionalized sense. That's what he was interested in. And there's diplomacy in the humane sense of paying attention to the sensibilities of others. And I think that second part, he said, that's very important, but not for international relations, and we're not going to talk about that. I want to talk about embassies, treaties, and so forth. But I think that notion of ideas of empathy, ideas of understanding the other side, that is well worth looking at, and not to come out with some sort of wishy-washy, touchy-feely, we can all hold hands and there'll be world peace, but just to succeed and to achieve one's objectives and to be aware of the other side's objectives. And I can't help but think, for example, that the top level of the American administration engaging with Russia at this point is awfully well versed in those kinds of concerns, whereas I worry that the Russians may be a lot better at understanding their interlocutor and who they're working with there. And that comes from a devaluation, perhaps, of diplomacy in general. Americans have always been suspicious of diplomacy, but also a devaluation of the need for personal relations and how those are to be successfully conducted. So to answer your question, there is a diplomatic approach to all human relations. Just think of your task of getting your colleagues to engage in the activity we're engaging in right now. That involved a negotiation. It involved talking to people and making things look attractive to them in their terms. And I think that's what I mean by saying that we all have an opportunity to be a diplomat.
Yeah.
And also when we're on holiday abroad, And people know that we're Brits or Americans or Uzbeks, and our country is judged by how we conduct ourselves. And there, whether we know it or not, we are in a diplomatic situation.
Yeah. You know, interestingly, one of the elements of diplomatic approach is asking question. Open questions, nice questions, but questions. Not just saying something directly, you should do this, or I expect from you to do something. But how about this? What do you think about that? So even there is a saying, I don't remember exact wordings, but there is a saying that kings, royals are managing things through questions. So if the royal would ask you or someone, what do you think about that? Would it be good to do this? The people tend to do this. So even from the top, some diplomacy could be done with just nicely asking question. That's a kind
Very nice.
of
Yeah.
all right.
And not
Yeah,
Socratic questions, not a logic. If this, then this, then this.
right, right,
But as you said, open-ended questions that
right, right.
give the respondent the opportunity to think through things.
Yeah, and of course, you should show some real interest, genuine interest, and trying to understand and listen. All those things in combination. It's a part of diplomatic relations among people. So we have a lot of this kinds of diplomacy might be around and also worth to pay attention. So, Paul, you are one of the pioneers of bringing social approach to diplomatic studies. You said many times, you wrote about diplomacy as a social practice.
Right.
Now, many diplomatic scholars also saying this and trying to approach diplomacy as a social practice. So, could you please explain your approach, your understanding diplomacy as a social practice? You already mentioned some aspect in our
Yeah.
conversation, but would you one more time
Sure.
explicitly explain this?
Well, I think there's two elements for my thinking
Mhm.
about this, and one we've already talked about is those values in human conduct that are traditionally associated with diplomats:
Mm.
empathy, subtlety, precision in communication where it's required, imprecision in communication where it's required, and the ability to judge what is needed in those terms. I think the second area of diplomacy as a social practice for me is the activity of representation.
Mm.
And in some ways, I go right back to the sort of Renaissance and medieval thinking about diplomacy, where the ambassador or the minister is said to embody his sovereign. That I stand for France.
Right.
In this situation, I am actually treat me as if I was the sovereign. But
Yeah, I am
more in
France.
our, yes, but in our more complex
Right.
times, the diplomat plays a big part in constructing the idea of states. When we look at a society of states, where do we see it? We don't. What we actually do is see diplomats, professional or otherwise, acting on behalf of and representing states
Mm.
and engaging in, and I'll move towards a sort of more Marxian sounding terminology here, in the production of identities. That diplomacy, foreign policy, we think of it as something to obtain concrete objectives, but we're also producing the identity of the state through our
Mm.
actions.
Mm.
Um, how do these theorists talk about the state is performed? and
Right,
diplomats are leading figures in the performance of a
right.
state.
Solemn entry.
Yes. Yeah.
Performance.
And like now you and I are performing the role of academics, intellectuals,
Right.
diplomats, and that's what gives. I was going to use the word substance, but it gives form to these things that we talk about.
Mm.
And if we are going to perform a social entity into existence or maintain its existence, we should be self-conscious and reflexive about that. We should be aware that that is what we're doing. I think,
Right.
to be honest, diplomats were well aware of this performative notion of social identity long before sociologists were. It was integral to diplomatic practice that they saw themselves
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
performing.
Totally agree.
And so, in that sense, I think diplomacy, more than say academia or law, diplomacy, one can understand it in terms of the language of social practice. It's very good fit for making sense of what's going on. And back to my original theme, and it is a situation in which the diplomats and the accumulated experience of diplomats has something to tell us, rather than us constantly telling diplomats what the world is like.
You know, in our current understanding, approach to diplomacy now, it is seeing diplomacy as a state-based diplomacy,
Yes.
as a part of international politics or foreign
Yes.
policy. From this perspective, when we see diplomacy as a part of foreign policy, international politics, and mainly as a state-based diplomacy,
Yes.
we could see much more closer relationship between diplomacy and politics. So diplomacy could be seen as a part of politics or instrument
Yes.
of politics. But when you're talking about the social approach or diplomacy as a social practice, does it mean that we could discover diplomacy not as a political activity or not as a part of political game or relationship, but just as a social practice without any politics? Or when we say diplomacy, it is always be part of somehow related to politics?
Well, I'm inclined to the latter in the sense that if we're talking about power, and power it plays an important role in outcomes, then it is political activity that we're talking about, and that certainly is what I'm interested in terms of what I want to pay attention to in international relations. But certainly, I can think of diplomacy as a social practice in terms of advice to individuals, to students, to human beings about how to conduct their relations. I think
Right.
I think Jeff Wiseman and his colleague David Wellman at DePaul University, their
Right.
master's program. I think they've retained the importance of power and politics in there, but they're looking for something broader and something more humane, and something, for example, that would focus on the cultural dimension to relations between different groups of people. And I think
Trans-professional diplomacy.
a trans-professional, absolutely. I think there's a great deal of scope for that. But let me concretize it a little bit. We think of all the new actors, and you and I have been around long enough to know that people have been talking about new actors ever since we've been in the game,
Right.
as it were. But think about most transnational corporations, multinational corporations, whatever you wish to call them. I'm pretty sure that most of them now have an office responsible for their international relations. That is responsible for aspects of their relations that cross borders and that specialize in that. What I very much doubt is whether they have what you and I would recognize, those international offices of the corporations have a diplomatic understanding of relations. They will probably not have a sense of systemic responsibility, or raison de système. How do we conduct our relations in such a way that the system as a whole continues to function? I think they're going to be much more not politically oriented, but economically oriented to transactions and to success in transactions. In other words, I think the international stage is increasingly populated by actors that feel no responsibility to the systemic requirements of the world and have complete commitment to either their company's business interests or their humanitarian organizations' problems, working on human rights, working on Greenpeace. They see themselves as outside agents trying to push things, which is good. That's what they do. States pursue their national interests, but you need that component that also has a systemic understanding. And what are the preconditions of us being able to conduct our business? And what is our role in maintaining those preconditions? And I think that's where we have a deficit. So certainly transnational corporations are conducting international relations. Not sure how diplomatically they are conducting those relations.
Very interesting, yeah. And you mentioned representation.
Yes.
Of course, you was the pioneer in studying representation in diplomacy as a representational phenomenon. Why an interest to representation now again we see among diplomatic scholars?
Yes. I was looking through some of my old papers the other day, and I saw that I'd written the University of Leicester with Jeff Berridge and Jan Mellison. They had a series of what we used to call blue books, diplomatic studies papers. And I wrote a paper, I think it was in 2004, called Representation in a Nationalist Era. And everybody said I was looking in the wrong direction, that I was mistaken to argue that it was a nationalist era, that we were moving beyond. And I like to think now that I wasn't so far off course. Incidentally, I also wrote a paper in 2000 for a Canadian journal on that is it time for the United States to join the Commonwealth? And I now see with great satisfaction that I was only 25 years ahead of my time. That second point is meant lightly, not as a serious point at all. I think of two notions of why the interest in representation. First of all, developments in international relations theory, paying attention to the sort of social theory, constructivism, those themes that you have been talking about. And people like Kostas Konstantinou, even Neumann, have alerted us to a body of work in sociology that working in our own little silo, we weren't aware of. And I think that has gradually filtered through to PhD students who become professors, who take on more PhD students. So a natural process in that sense. I suppose the other answer to why representation has become more important is that there are more and more actors and types of actors claiming a right to be represented. And when we have a climate expert, do we tack them on to the national delegation at a conference? Do they become part of the team? And if they're part of the team, are they expected to have a national perspective on scientific questions? Or do we have actors who participate, but not just participate, but participate with standing and are not rolled into a national or state team? So the question then becomes, how do we formalize their representation? And of course, we have all the old issues of peoples who wish to have states of their own, and those issues have not gone away.
Right.
And of course, the collapse of the USSR brought a new wave of participants in international life who became sovereign states. And so more actors claiming a role, whether being states or national movements or other sorts of actors. And in our own terms, the practice turn, as they call it in international theory, that has attuned us to these. And the relationship, of course, I tend to follow Jeff Wiseman's view that theory always follows practice. That we look at people doing things, and they're doing things first, and then we try to make sense of what they're doing, rather than imagine how things might be and then try and conform our actions to those imaginations.
All right. What do you think about the self-representation? I personally believe that people, individuals, could represent themselves. But some people are saying, well, representation means that someone represents the other one.
Yes.
But for example, at the court, a person could be represented by a lawyer, or he or she could represent himself or herself.
Yes.
So continuing this line of arguments, can we say that somehow we may speak about individual or diplomacy between individuals who represent themselves?
If within what context? In international
Social
life,
context,
or just a social context? My initial reaction, of course, is a sort of division of labor idea that life is complex and technical. I recently had my will edited and changed. I would not have wished to have done that on my own. If we come to sell our house, I would not want to be alone on the market. I'd like to be represented by someone with the expertise. So my first reaction, and I haven't given that much thought to this, Alisher, but my first reaction is one would have to become something of a polymath in terms of one's expertise in these complex areas. Now, as a humane notion, that each of us approaches each other as sovereign, as different, as worthy of respect.
Yeah.
There, I think you might have something, but that might come down to the simple teachings that we teach our children, or try to teach them through religious forms of understanding, through simple aphorisms, wisdom, if you like.
Right.
I don't know how that would elaborate.
Taking responsibility, being accountable, taking responsibility.
I remember many years ago now, I met a chap who had been he'd been in the Red Army. He was from Crimea. He identified himself as Russian, but was reasonably content with the political arrangements that had followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. But he said, the society I live in is so corrupt that I do not know what to teach my children. Because if I teach them the standard values of telling the truth, being honest, being respectful, they will not do well in this society. And so I have to teach them the realities, as it were, of life. And I think that is, again, that is a situation where we try to develop judgment in those who we're responsible for and who are dependent on us, and a question of judgment. I'm just waving my wife goodbye there. Excuse me.
Yeah. It's very important thing in diplomacy, perhaps
Yeah.
one of the most important thing, judgment. It's a skill.
Yeah.
And you are also known as a constructivist in international relations theory and in diplomatic studies.
Yeah.
So could you please give us some idea what's the value of constructivism in studying diplomacy? What constructivism can offer in studying diplomacy?
Some people have said I'm an English school. Other people have suggested constructivist. I think
they are very close to each other.
As I get old, well, there's big arguments within constructivism too. As I get older, I'm convinced that I'm a sharpist, and that's about that's about as
You
far as you
coined
can.
a very important and nice term.
But to answer your question more properly, I think, and it is to return to the theme we were talking about earlier, the extent to which social reality and actors within social reality are produced. That it is an exercise of production that is going on all the time. Here's, if I have anything to add to that, it is the implication that if social reality is constructed and the actors within it are produced and producing at the same time, the implication there is that then we can reconstruct and that we can radically change things. If it is all just a construction, then let us produce something else. I think that is misconceived. And I think that our commitments to the way we think things are, I'm going to use the metaphor of roots here, but it's a tricky one, but we are much more committed to the way things are than we perhaps realize. And so the idea that we can rethink ourselves to a better place, I'm very, very skeptical of. There was a nice piece written many years ago now by John Mearsheimer. He tried to engage the constructivists, and I am not sympathetic to his approach and his arguments about offensive realism. But he said, okay, we live in a world that is socially constructed. How come the same old themes keep getting constructed? And he wanted to claim, of course, that there is a simpler reality in those terms. So we put on one pair of glasses and we see a major change in the latter half of the 20th century is the disappearance, or first half, of the disappearance of the Russian Empire, the emergence of the Soviet Union. Look at transformation. But with the hindsight perspective that we now have, we see the continuities. Russia never went away. It was always, in a sense, Russia, from empire to Soviet Union to federation today. Same stories we can tell about China. Look at how China reasserts itself. And these things that we think as transformations tend to be very small in some
That's
ways.
a very good point. When we think or say about constructivism, we also need to think and say about reconstructivism or reconstruct as well.
And also, I am not sympathetic to reducing that the construction project is, say, all about power, or it is all about class and exploitation. That the project has a telos, a logic to it that's shaped by something. And I don't think that is the case. I think it's just straight old complicated. But it doesn't change as much as we would think it does or would like it to change.
Okay. Paul, you are the author of very important, very fundamental book, which is Diplomatic Theory of International Relations, published in 2009 by Cambridge University Press. So since so many years already passed. How has your approach evolved since publication of this book,
Yeah.
Diplomatic Theory of International Relations?
Well, first of all, I was absolutely delighted and somewhat surprised that it was successful. And it was an attempt to reinterpret more traditional understandings of diplomacy and what it has to offer in the language that we were talking at that time in terms of international theory. So, for example, the big theme about relations of separateness and how separateness is different from internal relations, that was very much derived from an insight from Alan James, talking about diplomacy, and he had a much more legal perception of what was going on. So in that sense, I was very much drawing on ideas that were already there. I think I am gratified by the success of that work. I'm a little bit disappointed, and I think if my professional circumstances have been different, in other words, having graduate students working for me, this might have been different. But I don't think that my argument that diplomacy has something to tell international relations was taken up. The conversation is still about what every other perspective has to tell diplomacy. And there's very little talking back from either diplomats or, more importantly, students of diplomacy about what it has to tell other practices. And that, I think, for me, is a disappointment that it didn't produce a lot of follow-up literature. In terms of how my ideas have changed since then, I think I've moved backwards rather than forwards, although I think I'm more in tune with the times, in the sense that actually we should be paying more attention to state-based diplomacy. And we should be paying more attention to the kinds of problems that are being generated by the shifts in the balance of power, the rise of China, the European project's failure to redefine international relations. And it is a weak player now in the way the game is currently being played. The trouble with looking back is, and this is a great problem for academics as a social practice, is it leaves us very little new to say. What we're constantly doing is looking back and rediscovering things rather than moving forward in terms of the construction project that we talked about later. So if I say to you that international relations today are starting to look more and more like the international relations of the early 19th century or late 19th century, struggle for power between great powers, well then what else is there to say other than to look back at that and see how it played out? And as well, you know, academics are caught by the need for novelty in the marketplace, just as anybody else. And it's very difficult to say new things in those.
So what diplomacy could suggest?
What does, given what I've been arguing, what has diplomacy to tell the world today in terms of the international relations and issues that we worry about? Well, first of all, if I had a good answer to that, I'd be closer to the White House or to London. But my answer is very, very generic in some ways. First of all, slow down. Secondly, stop feeling like you have to generate input into media and social media. That's very frightening for politicians to do. They get accused of not caring or not being in touch. But we're not sure what they need to be in touch with at the moment, given the way the news cycle operates and generates more and more more shocking news stories, if you like. So this is always bad when a government does it, but an appeal for calm, an appeal for slowing down and reflection, and for stepping aside from the narrow perspectives that seem to be driving, for example, Russian foreign policy. The problem, of course, is securing an audience for that argument, and that I don't have an answer to. Well, the answer is the one that people will not listen. We will run into collisions. The collisions will have terrible costs, and at that point, people will start listening. Human beings are learning animals, but human beings are forgetting animals. And they have to relearn their lessons at great cost, tragically.
Could you say a few words about your view on digital diplomacy and non-state actor diplomacy?
I think diplomacy, like other aspects of human relations, is being interrogated by these technical changes that we see coming. You've mentioned digital diplomacy, but increasingly now our reflections on artificial intelligence. And for example, in principle, its capacity to carry out routine tasks. And routine tasks of finding out information, identifying patterns, and even producing responses. So we could theoretically see routine communications hugely changed by these sorts of developments. The other change that I see it in our students in undergraduate education, I see it in the workplace, is the simplification of communication. That increasingly the work experience of our students will be on a screen like this and responding to options. And their ability to identify the key bullet points and reproduce them at a certain point. That seems to me to reflect the machine intelligence that's lying behind or underneath these processes. And it leaves little space for reflection on the part of the individual, student, diplomat, business person, what have you. It leaves little opportunity for nuance or subtlety, even though people talk about that. Those are rarely demonstrated. So I see a restriction in communication and simplification in communication. And of course, I don't think that's very good for diplomacy. And I don't think it's very good for a diplomatic approach to handling human relations. One approach, back to our earlier theme, problem solving. What's the answer? How do we solve it? Whereas the diplomatic perspective might suggest there isn't an answer, or more particularly, there are multiple answers, but we cannot get to any of them. So how do we live in the absence of answers? Well, we rub along with each other with some questions not resolved. I'm a bit pessimistic about this because many years ago, I was in graduate school in Aberystwyth in Wales. I didn't last very long there, but whilst I was there, I met a Welsh nationalist who was very keen on the Welsh language, was fluent in it. And he used to say to me that Welsh was so much better than English because it was more nuanced, more subtle, and it could capture aspects of the human experience that English couldn't capture. And I looked at him and I thought to myself, that may be true, but it doesn't matter because I do not speak Welsh. And Welsh is disappearing, and a global English, which is a simpler form. It's not even the English of my fathers. It is a different sort of English, and it is a simpler language. If my hunches and your hunches about human beings are right and our hunches about diplomacy are right, we're moving into a mode of communication which is not conducive to subtlety and is not conducive. And we can say this to these people and they will have the same response as I had to my Welsh colleague.
Okay. So even with all this rapid development of IT, digital tools, AI, you are saying you still very much value human relations and you see it as an essential part of human diplomacy.
And being self-conscious about that. It's
Mm,
not just a description of a world.
mm,
It is a guide to how we should think ourselves and how we should approach conducting relations,
all right.
which is sometimes I worry that just boils down to we ought to be good and we should behave ourselves. Simple values, easily said, not so easily done for a variety of reasons.
All right. And one or two words about NGOs, non-state actors.
I'll go back to my theme, which I was talking about in 2009, and I have not given it a great deal of thought. It's Richard Langhorne's term. I want to see them becoming diplomatic, not just international, but diplomatic,
Interesting.
rather than seeing themselves as outsiders who
Mm,
have no stake or more particularly responsibility for the system, but just try to
mm,
get what they can out of it, that they take on the burden. They take on the burden that foreign ministries and governments have
right.
taken over the years.
Yeah. I noticed that you are using the word not just diplomacy, but diplomatic.
Very
So
much so.
it's a very important concept, it seems to me, for you to be
Yeah,
diplomatic, not just to be a diplomat, but to be a diplomatic. Is it
yeah,
correct?
yeah. I think um, I think that people can answer this question in different ways, but any definition of diplomacy, it has to have some notion that it's about human relations.
Mm,
It has to have some notion about who does it, who gets to
mm,
undertake it. It has to have some notion of on behalf of whom they do it, representation. It has to have some notion of what it's about, what
mm,
those relations are about. And finally, and I think I've gradually come to this, the most important one is the last one, which is, and how are they best undertaken if we are to achieve satisfactory outcomes? And I think
mm,
that's the clincher, is being diplomatic.
mm.
And that comes from a culture of professional diplomacy and diplomacy prior to the modern system.
That's great. That's absolutely wonderful. And I have my last question, if you don't mind.
Please.
You know, you are a well-known scholar. As I said, you're a living classic in diplomatic studies. Your contribution is huge with wonderful books, articles, very important, and you are a wise man. Imagine
I
that
try.
yes, imagine that you have a chance to speak to world leaders now. You
Uh,
study a lot of, you spent a lot of time to studying diplomacy, and you know a lot.
yeah.
So, what would you say to them in terms of resolving these terrible conflicts now? Russia-Ukraine war, the conflict in Middle East, and some other. How can and should they act and diplomacy could work in order to resolve this? What would be your message?
I think it's a very practical problem, which is the first thing I would say is stop thinking about what you want and how to get it, and
Mm,
start thinking about the situation in which you find yourself and the costs of how you are handling the situation. And I think after I said the first part, the key leaders that we are currently talking about would ask me to leave the room. That they would say, you have nothing to tell me. And I think that is one of the most worrying things at the moment, is that the sort of things we have to say, we, those who study diplomacy, those who have practiced it and taken on its approach, we do not have pull. Those values, it's hard to secure an audience for them. So in that sense, I'm fairly pessimistic. I imagine talking to Mr. Putin, President Putin right now. I don't think he'd want to hear anything I had to say. I think it would be, let us start looking for leaders who are interested in listening to the sorts of things we have to say.
This is their problem, but I'm interested in your message.
Okay. So, very well put. That's a good. That is a good response. I am sympathetic to the idea that at least in the immediate, we should find out ways of stopping killing people, and find a way of doing that which doesn't threaten parties who see themselves at a disadvantage there. A ceasefire in Ukraine, for example, or a ceasefire in Gaza. Israel worries about the loss of momentum and the recovery of Hamas. And Ukraine worries that a ceasefire cements its losses, its territorial losses. So to think creatively about assuaging that fear, that things are still to be negotiated, there is still the possibility of them gaining what they want, or some of what they want. But let us right now try and stop the killing, without being very confident that I'd be successful in making that case. I just give you a clue, and I frighten myself with this, but when I think through Chamberlain's approach to appeasement, I'm quite sympathetic to it, even though we know the consequences that came of it. The idea that because of what we've achieved today, thousands of people are going to be alive rather than not be alive. I think that is a good starting point, even though we have to worry that if the other side doesn't respect that, then we put ourselves in a very weak position. There's the problem.
Well, thank you so much. It's very, very interesting, very powerful. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation. It's always very nice to see you, talk to you, and read your works. It is just wonderful that you exist and doing so many things for diplomacy. If you would like to say maybe some other words, you're welcome.
Thank you, Alisher. You'd say the honor is yours, but the honor is mine to have been asked. And I'm very much pleased to be asked and glad that we were able to work this out. The other thing is I very much liked your questions. And your questions got me thinking. And as the older we get, the more reluctant we are to explore new things or to look critically at ourselves. And those questions very much helped me start to think about things. And indeed, our interview here, a little bit, as you can probably tell, was thinking on my feet. And that's where novelty comes in. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you now. Bye-bye.